Hi. So the last few days I've been thinking about these talks ongoing in Riyadh, ostensibly to end the war in Ukraine. Um, but the overwhelming issue that's coming out of this is the stance of the Americans. And it's not surprising, but I find it utterly reprehensible. Now, usually with videos like this, or with a lot of my videos, what I do is I take a particular report and I just quote directly from a paper. This was today's newspaper. I'm not going to read anything out just because I want to do this in a slightly different way. Um, anyway, this is today's newspaper. There, Sergei Lavrov. Um, Yeah, usually I'll just read out a report for just reasons of being compact and just having the material on hand. But I want to just speak directly from my mind here. I am absolutely disgusted with Donald Trump and Marco Rubio and the American delegation with the stance that they're taking. Um, of course, I'm thoroughly anti-Putin, but you'd expect that from the Russians. I mean, you know, how else do you expect the gangster regime to act? As other than what they have done, making the sort of demands that they're making and utterly subverting a smaller neighbor. I mean, it's this is Russia. This is Putin's Russia. It's what you expect. I honestly think that Trump's second term raises so many questions about, frankly, the stability of the West. I think there's very strong historic echoes of what we're seeing in Riyadh. The fact that Ukraine has essentially been, I mean, it's been de facto pushed out of the room. The fact that Zelensky wasn't even invited, it's just contemptible. How can you have peace negotiations about a country and not invite that country to take part? This is nonsensical. That the country most affected by the war is absolutely left out of it. Now, of course, in any conflict, you're going to have both warring parties. So I don't say that Russia shouldn't be invited. You know, I think there should be pressure on Russia to get the hell out of Ukraine. But and the United States, is the world's most powerful country, so it's going to play a role. The Saudis, those great lovers of human rights, I'm not sure how much input they're having into the negotiations other than it being hosted there. The Gulf states in general have, I'm not sure if we'd actually count Saudi as a Gulf state, but I was going to say in general they've had quite a leading role in diplomacy in recent years. Qatar had a key role in the Gaza-Israel talks. So credit where credit's due. But here's the thing. I think there's a lot of distortion going on because what Trump and his supporters are sort of framing this as is if you oppose this angle, then you're somehow pro-war. I got very angry with a group that in my view, should have known better. I won't go into further details, but I'll just leave it at that. Simply because it'll open up a whole other thing, and I don't want to muddy the waters too much. But let's just say it's a group that should have known better, and they were framing anyone who wants to stand up to Putin as being war lovers. This sort of narrative has been used before by the likes of Tulsi Gabbard. That those who want to appease dictators, the smear that they use against those who stand up to dictators is you love war. Well, knowing personally now, I've actually made more connections with the Ukrainian community here. Um, so knowing Ukrainians personally, I can tell you that of course, they want to see an end to war. They've seen their cities bombed, they've seen their people killed, they've seen their POWs tortured, they've seen people rendered homeless, displaced. Of course, they want peace. Ukrainians don't love war. But I think it is so arrogant for outsiders to just expect them to give up. And the thing I find so repulsive is these MAGA Republicans that are pushing this. I'm not even talking about the Russians, right? I'm talking about MAGA Republicans and some Brits, it has to be said, who are pushing this. I would challenge them, would you seriously even fathom the idea of having a big chunk of this country or a big chunk of the United States invaded, occupied, and then as part of peace negotiations, you just give it up, and then you are told you cannot join any international organizations, and all the other demands that Russia is making. It's preposterous. So the hypocrisy of those lecturing Ukraine is reprehensible. Trump had a rant today personally attacking Volodymyr Zelensky, calling him a mediocre clown or mediocre comedian, and just this rant, personally attacking Zelensky. And Trump seemed to actually be bothered by the fact that the Ukrainians, understandably, are not happy about being pushed out of the delegation. What the hell does Trump expect? He comes from the business world. You'd think he would understand that if there's some sort of merger going on or some sort of big trade negotiation or business deal, that anyone pushed out of it would feel aggrieved by that. I just feel so much disgust towards Donald Trump. He is the worst president in American history. The man is a disgrace. And I think he's even worse in his second term. This is strong, strong echoes of 1938, when Western powers treated Czechoslovakia the way they did. It's just the echoes of history are very strong, and history never repeats exactly the same. There will be some different context, but there are echoes. I really do think the 2020s and the 1930s do have parallels. We see appeasement. We see the rise of autocracy. We see demagogue leaders. The echoes are obvious. We see dangers in Europe. This is all echoes of history. It's not hyperbole to say that you could draw those sort of analogies. Now, Zelensky's not perfect. Nobody is. I don't say that Zelensky cannot be criticised. And within Ukraine, it's true that there is even some dissatisfaction within Ukraine towards Zelensky and within the Ukrainian political system. But in wartime, leaders do take certain powers that wouldn't be there at peacetime for necessary reasons. Anyone condemning Volodymyr Zelensky needs to look at the position he is in. He is a man leading a country who has been invaded. I find the smears against him to be utterly unfair, because any leader in his position would be doing absolutely everything they can to be getting international support. So, this sort of smear that he's just after money, and it's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. This is a man who absolutely... I've got so much respect for Zelensky, because this is a guy who must never get any sleep. He sees his country bombarded, subjugated. He goes on shuttle diplomacy, trying to drop support. He's dealing with so many situations at once, and yet he still has the ability to keep going. Zelensky must have iron skin to go what he's... I just have so much respect for the man. He's not perfect. I'm not going to say he's perfect. I'm not going to say his administration's perfect. But what Trump came out with today, if I was Zelensky, I'd say it's a compliment, coming from the worst president in American history. And any decent American should be embarrassed by Donald Trump. I don't consider MAGA Republicans to be decent Americans. I think they're jingoistic, inward-looking idiots, quite honestly. I think they're ignorant about what's going on in the world. I think that they have a very short memory. I think they're very easily pleased. I don't have much respect for them. And they're responsible for putting this man back in power. So, we're 1 month into Trump's second term, and it's 4 years. I just think... But here's an important point, regarding peace, because, like I say, the Ukrainians want peace, but not at any price. Because if you force a country to absolutely subjugate itself to a larger neighbour, Is that true peace? Let's say the Ukrainians just capitulate, they just give up, which they won't do, but let's say they do. Putin gets what he wants. There may technically be, quiet on the battlefield, but what does that mean? I mean, anyone with a grasp of history should understand the Ukrainian position. The Holodomor is within living memory. It's getting further back now, but it is within living memory. I'm talking about the massive famine caused by Stalin in the 30s. Millions of Ukrainians killed. It was one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Ukrainians have a long history of being subjugated by Russia. So it's not just the 2022 invasion. This is something that they know goes back into history. So Ukraine, more than most countries, certainly some other countries in Central and Eastern Europe would know about this, and in the Caucasus would know about Russia's history. But I just think it is such a cowardly, morally contemptible position that Trump and Rubio are taking. Rubio, I used to think he was a moderate Republican, and this is a man who has a track record of actually speaking out against dictatorships. Rubio has been kept very vocal about the Castro regime in Cuba. To his credit, I think he's right to be outspoken about that. And yet, when it comes to Putin, Rubio's happy to lend his name to those list of appeasers. I think comparing Trump to Neville Chamberlain is unfair. Neville Chamberlain. I think Chamberlain, there's a lot of things can be said about the events of Munich. There is a more recent argument, actually, that rather than being outright appeasement, Chamberlain thought he could contain Hitler, and actually he wasn't naive. He did know that Hitler was a threat, but he thought he could contain it. But we know historically that Chamberlain's stance was a serious mistake. Peace in our time and all of that. Apparently Hitler was actually impatient in the room. I just see a lot of parallels here. Now, it might be lazy to say Putin is Hitler, but the echoes of history, I think, are palpable, and there is some similar themes. Putin's justified this by talking about, initially with the invasion, it was about protecting Russian speakers. The Third Reich used the same excuse about protecting German speakers. So I suppose the question is, what should Britain's stance be? Starmer has attracted controversy recently for talking about being willing to send in British troops, and Starmer has arguably been more outspoken than any Western leader on this. The situation in Germany, Friedrich Merz will almost certainly be Chancellor at the end of this week. I imagine he'll take a consistent stance. But Germany has not been as gung-ho, and I don't even want to use that term. I don't think that Germany's going to commit troops in the same way. France, Macron, frankly, has altered his position a bit. He started off wanting to negotiate with Putin, and then he took a harder stand. Basically, I think France and Germany, they support Ukraine, but it's a little bit inconsistent. With Britain, it's one thing this country has got right, and I would honestly say I'm proud of it, that we have got this right consistently. And the governments of Johnson, Truss, Sunak and Starmer have all taken this strong stance on Ukraine, and I appreciate that. I think that's justified. And I appreciate that it isn't a party political issue. It's not Labour or Tory, it's just doing the right thing. I just wish Starmer was more consistent regarding China. He's kind of taken a soft stance on China and a hard stance on Russia. He needs to be more hardline on both. Not the same situation. I'm not saying we're not at war with China, but and we're not technically at war with Russia, but this is absolutely Cold War Mark II. I mean, I don't know how anyone could look at the current situation and think the answer to it is just give Putin what he wants. And what I find really contemptible is when people regurgitate Russian narratives about Russia being surrounded by NATO. This is a myth. Look at a map of the world. The vast majority of Russia's borders are in Asia. It's not surrounded by NATO. And as the Finnish president said, it's Russian actions that are pushing countries into NATO for security. Russia's like A thief that goes into someone's house, steals something, then complains when the homeowner catches them. It's If Russia wants to get on with its neighbours, maybe it should stop tyrannising them. Um, Unfortunately, one of the biggest tools that's being used at the moment is propaganda. And if we look across the so-called global south, particularly Africa and many Asian countries, there's a very different outlook on this. It's either neutral, like both sides are equally to blame, or regrettably and depressingly, a lot of people are hoodwinked into actually blaming the Ukrainians, or maybe more specifically blaming NATO. But let's be very clear, NATO never attacked Russia. Let's also be clear that the West tried to work with Russia. 2000, the Kursk submarine disaster. Norway and Britain offered to help Russia. Putin's response was callously to put his own ego and pride above the lives of his own men. So over 60 guys died in that submarine disaster. Norwegian and British help could have potentially saved their lives. Russia was a member of the G8. I remember back in 2005 when we hosted the G8 that year, and there's all the events going on in London. Russia was there. Russia was brought into the fold. So this idea that after the Cold War, Russia was looked down on and not treated with respect, etc., it's just not true. There was even hope that Russia could be a partner. At one point, a million years ago, in a distant universe, Russia was even contemplated as being a member of NATO. I mean, that's incomprehensible now, but the saddest thing about this situation is that the Ukrainians may well be forced to capitulate, even with European support. I think it is right. I'll say this, and this is no vindication of Donald Trump. Some European countries maybe do need to wake up regarding defence. I'll say that. But the idea that we take lectures from the Americans on this, the narrative is something like this: why should America always come in and help Europe? But this idea that America is always motivated for altruistic reasons is false. I mean, for one thing, I believe it's Article 5, has only been triggered once in NATO, which was actually to defend the United States after September 11th. So this idea that American exceptionalists would have that, we always come in and save your ass in Europe, to put it crudely. I mean, they always come up with that line regarding World War II. September 1939 to December 1941, over 2 years, the United States wasn't in the war. So Americans need to stop that sort of narrative. We came in and saved everyone. They played a very big role, and lots of young Americans laid down their lives, but Britain was the only major Western power that was essentially standing alone. I always say, there were courageous resistance movements. We know about the Polish and Czech members of the RAF. We know about the courageous resistance movements in France and the Netherlands and Norway, especially in countries like Greece and other countries that were occupied by the Third Reich. But it is true. I think there is justification in Britain feeling some pride regarding 1940. I mean, revisionists would have it sort of saying, no, that's overplayed. I don't think so. If you look at a map of Europe at that time, Western Europe had been absolutely overwhelmed. Spain was neutral but pro-fascist. It was a very dark time. There were courageous resistance movements, but if you were living in Kent or Lincolnshire in 1940, it's a scary time. So I get fed up with Americans coming in and say, we saved your ass. The only reason America was forced into World War II is because of Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt had constantly been facing barriers in Congress. And we even have MAGA Republicans now, perversely but not surprisingly, claiming that we were on the wrong side and actually trying to legitimize the Third Reich. I mean, this is just, it's worse than ignorance. It's just contemptible. I don't know what's going to happen with this. My concern is that if Ukraine forced to capitulate, I mean, that would be such a depressing situation. And it would be a complete and utter failure of American leadership. An absolute failure. Um, I think Neville Chamberlain was a far more decent man than Donald Trump, but Chamberlain got it dead wrong. Trump hasn't just got it dead wrong, but he's a despicable character. I mean, um, this idea, oh, we'll help you if we can get access to your iron ore. It's like Trump treats international diplomacy like business deals. And then, they frame it like they have concern for the Ukrainians, so we want to stop people dying. That sounds all noble on the surface. But then you consider that the Ukrainians aren't even getting a voice in this. So what sort of compassion is that? I think the truth is Trump has always been soft on Putin. And MAGA Republicans who think this is strength, they're deluded. Right now, Donald Trump does not look strong. He looks like a wannabe dictator pandering to dictators. He looks like he's an embarrassment. I mean, if you live in some red state and you're, absolutely endorsing the cult of Trump, you might see him as strong. And I guess he's strong in the sense he's got a political mandate in the United States. But internationally, I guarantee Donald Trump is absolutely destroying America's global standing. America's becoming really unpopular right now thanks to the actions of Donald Trump. I'm not anti-American, but if it comes to choosing between Europe and America, frankly, I think we should look at our closest neighbours. There's a lot more to say about this, but I want to just get it out. I'm so disgusted by what's transpired in Riyadh. And for Trump smears against a man like Volodymyr Zelensky, with what he's been through, with what his country's been through. Trump was deferred from military service because of bone spurs. Now, that's a medical issue. But for him to be coming out with the stuff he is, it's beneath contempt. And I don't know how any serving soldier, sailor, or air personnel can support this man. I don't know how anyone with a conscience can support this man. Donald Trump is unquestionably the worst president in American history. I would actually go that far because someone like Andrew Johnson, who was a pretty awful president, there wasn't even the context that we're in today. 19th century presidents didn't travel. So for Donald Trump to be coming out with what he's coming out with on the international level, it's just Buchanan's often accused of not doing enough to prevent the American Civil War, but to be fair, that was a poison chalice. Any president in that position would have found it challenging. Warren Harding's administration was very corrupt. Richard Nixon, of course, was very corrupt. But I think Trump is uniquely bad. I just think he's said everything that could be said. But I'm going to wrap this up. But the appeasement and the victim blaming, it's the Ukrainian people deserve more than this. I mean, those who think this is just about Ukraine, by the way, anyone in Britain who thinks it's just about Ukraine, don't forget Salisbury. Don't forget a British citizen died. I mean, the day that these appeasers wake up and realise what we're dealing with a gangster regime in Moscow. I think possibly the only way the Putin regime ends is either an internal coup that succeeds or the fragmentation of Russia. It's just over a year to the day since Alexei Navalny died, and I have so much respect for Russian dissidents, but they really, it's hard to see how they can succeed in this context. A lot of Russians, unfortunately, I'd love to say that most Russians are anti-Putin, but it's not the case. I think it is a minority of educated Russians, and they know the risks for speaking out. Some of them courageously do. I do think dissident Russians are some of the bravest people in the world. My Ukrainian friends may or may not agree, but I do believe it takes guts to speak out against that regime. Knowing that you could go to prison for years, languishing in a Siberian prison, what sort of prospect is that? Job loss, vilification. But when we look back at history, I think it should judge Trump very, very harshly. Because even if there's an artificial peace, what sort of peace is that? The subjugation of a nation? And anyone from Kenya, Vietnam, Malaysia, or any other country that wants to lecture the Ukrainians, I put it to you, would you be okay with your country being subjugated, say, by one of the old European colonial powers? That's hypocrisy. You make a lot about independence, yet when it comes to the Ukrainians, you don't afford them the same way of thinking. Why shouldn't they defend their country? Why shouldn't they be able to stand up for their sovereignty?